I want to take a little sidetrack because most people don't know this, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but hopefully I give you enough for you to go off and do your own research. What is Lexipol? Lexipol is, in the simplest terms, it is a template for writing policies for police departments and law enforcement agencies that a private company created, that virtually every city in California and now almost all the states use. The history is this. In 2003, it was founded in California by a gentleman named Bruce Prate. He was a former law enforcement officer and then became an attorney. He founded it when he was an attorney. His goal, and this was a good goal, was to codify the myriad and wildly varying law enforcement policies throughout the state. He confronted in his experience as an attorney and as a law enforcement officer. And he said, wow, different cities have different laws, that some of them comply with state law, some of them do not. Some of them are in direct violation of federal law. It's just matched, like literally the Wild West. And he said, I'm going to write a policy manual that helps, and he started with one city, his city, that codifies our police code and makes sure that everything that we require of our police conforms with state law and conforms with federal law. So he wrote that policy manual, and then he decided to help another city. Another city came along and said, hey, we like what you did. Will you help us? And he did. And then he did another. And pretty soon he realized he had a business on his hand. He then hooked up with a couple other guys. One was another law enforcement officer, Gordon Graham, and then a business guy, Dan Merkel, who then became the chairman and CEO. Once that happened and they incorporated fully in California, they quickly expanded to 40 cities. And now it's used in over 8,000 agencies across the nation and is now a Texas corporation. If you look around this area, virtually, I mean, I could not find a city here in the Bay Area that does not follow the Lexipol template. So I'm still characterizing this as a good thing. It's called standardization. I'm a believer in standardization. Lair is a believer in standardization because that creates consistency. The problem that happened, and the reason we have a troubled interpretation and stance when it comes to Lexipol-based policies, and ours is a Lexipol-based policy, is that the company Lexipol has now become an advocate. They become a lobbyist, and they lobby very actively against many of the things that we believe in terms of improving police community relations. They don't believe in de-escalation techniques, to bring down the level of use of force in any confrontation. They do not believe there should be limitations on use of force, that it should be completely the officer's judgment. They do not believe there should be constraints on military equipment. And they often support law enforcement personnel officers that are accused of malfeasance. They'll side with the case against an officer under accusation in order to they use their own policy interpretations to side with supporting the decisions that officers make, even in some of the most obvious cases where the officer did something wrong. So the fact that now they're a company of two minds, I use that phrase, they're a company of two minds. They have a good mind, which is creating standard policy, but now they have a troubled mind where they're becoming very partisan in terms of siding with what you might call the more intense types of policing. It creates, in our opinion, a conflict of interest. So it's something to keep in mind as we start to assess our policy. So our overall objectives in reforming the draft MEUP 709 that our PD put forward are as follows. And this results from a very in-depth assessment of the policy. I'm sorry about that bell. Right now that I've started the recording, I can't get out of here and go turn it off. That's my email. Anyways, we want our policy to abide by the requirements of 8041, and it significantly falls short. So there are literally several sections that 481 requires that our policy is missing. And I'll talk about that later. We want to address community concerns. We've done some outreach, officially, unofficially, and we've listened to some public comment. We've formed our own opinions as well. And there are significant concerns about what our policy calls authorized uses. It's missing accountability. It has partial accountability, but not the full requirements of 481. It lacks independent oversight entirely. And it's very, very minimal on consequences in terms of being explicit that there are consequences for breaking the rules. We want it to improve its transparency and accuracy. There are some typos, there are some misstatements, there are some vague descriptions that allow inappropriate interpretation based on what 481 requires. And then finally, this is what we call the enrichment portion. As I explained to you, AB 481 does not shy away from historical reckoning, but our policy is completely silent on it. And we believe that from a philosophical standpoint, in fact, that's one of the lexical template chapters is philosophy, that we lack philosophy, we lacked a broad policy scope, we lack the kind of enrichment that explains to the public why we even need this policy, what's in it for them, why should it be there. We do believe that we should retain the lexipol defaults, i.e. the default structure, and only because it is the standard that everybody uses, but we want the content to be enriched. And we're not violating lexipol's standard by doing that. Lexipol gives great latitude to the agencies in terms of which sections they want to include in their policy, what they want to put in each section. It's basically a big outline and you can, choose. However, what you do have to do is abide by 481. And finally, we want to achieve best of class based on an assessment of other agencies throughout California. So I conducted an assessment, and I'll describe that in a bit and tell you what I found. My method was as follows to do this analysis. I did a thorough reading and outlining of AB 481 and its related legislative arguments. I went into what the legislature went through, the pros, the cons, the edits, the changes, what it started as, what it ended up as, to understand how 481 came to be. Then I reviewed the Department of Justice's guidance for use on specific human characteristics in law enforcement. What that really means is the DOJ's use of race in law enforcement policy. The reason I wanted to understand those advisories by the Department of Justice is because I wanted to make sure that our policy, as 481 does, is not shy from talking about demographics. And I wanted to understand what kind of terminology is appropriate to use according to the Department of Justice. That's a federal, as well as a state oversight. So that educated me in terms of appropriate language as I created edits. Next, we wanted to listen to and itemize community concerns. Already talked about that. And then here's the thing, the survey. I surveyed the military use policies. And by the way, all these agencies, all these cities and counties that are writing military use policies right now, we're all at the same state. We've presented drafts to their cities or counties. And that happened, earlier this year. And now everybody's going through city council or, whatever form of government a city uses, town councils, mayors, whatever. They're going through the back and forth with the public and to derive there. So I would say every single that is doing right now in California is what you call in the process of deriving and editing their MEUP policies. So I investigated all the drafts of over 25 other agencies all over California. I looked at big towns, little towns. I looked at counties. I looked at cities. I looked at progressive cities and very conservative cities. I looked at rural and I looked at big cities. While I looked at LA, which is our biggest city, I did not use anything from the LA. And the only reason I didn't is because, number one, I found wonderful stuff everywhere else. And number two, LA is just at such a scale. It's almost a state by itself. It was just going to be way too much for a city of our size. So I learned about it, but then I put it aside and did not access it for actual policy ideas. And the results was of the 25 agencies I reviewed, I ended up literally copying wonderful elements from these police departments, Los Alamitos, Hayward, Long Beach, Sacramento, and Culver City. And I ended up also looking at using some stuff from the county of San Diego, because they're under the guise of a sheriff. More recently, before I actually made this presentation, I've come to some conclusions, good conclusions about a county of Santa Clara, their sheriff, in terms, I know there's controversy about the actual sheriff that they had, but in terms of policy within the department when it came to the military equipment, they are actually writing right now a increasingly wonderful policy. So I'm starting to grasp some of those as they're coming aware, but I didn't mention it here because I don't have enough hard data to really hang my hat on it yet. And then finally, I went off and I interviewed law enforcement personnel, but I stayed away from Los Altos because I just felt it was important for me to keep an at arm's length in terms of interviews on what law enforcement personnel, both in PD and in sheriff's types of agencies, what they thought of military equipment, what they thought of use of force, what they thought about the policy, what they thought about their day-to-day job and how it relates to the policy. And I got a lot of input. So now what I'm going to do for the next bunch of slides, every slide is one section of our policy, not AB 481, our policy. And I'm going to tell you what our in terms of things that it does well and things that it really needs to do because it doesn't do it right now. So right off, 709.1, which is the purpose and scope. Right now, our section 7901 is one sentence, and it basically says we're going to conform to AB 481. It doesn't even say AB 481. It says government code, and it gives a number. So nobody thinks, you have to go look up state code to figure out what it is. It says we're going to follow it. And that's just not sufficient. So some of the biggest edits that we want to make is to really expand the purpose and scope. We want to inform the public in a more comprehensive way. What's the policy about? Why does it exist? We want to mention 481. We want to enable members of the public to answer the question, what's in it for me? Why do I care? We want to describe the context within which the policy is being written. That's where we talk about transparency, accountability, kind of from an overall, even though each of those sections have specific chapters later on, we want to kind of set that groundwork right up front. We want to invoke the key aims of 481. We want to express philosophy, and we want to be explicit about transparency. Right up front, prose, it's not bullet, it's prose. It's talking to the public and saying, this is why you should read the rest of this policy. It's not just an inventory list. The definitions, ironically, that is a list. And this is where we talk about various terms that are used later on in the policy. Our original draft is excessively abridged. It should be more closely aligned with AB 481's definitions. The simplest example I can give you is, remember I showed you what a tracked vehicle was? AB 481 will tell you a tracked vehicle is a vehicle that doesn't use wheels, that runs on tracks and explains it. Ours says tracked vehicles. And in my talking to various members of the public, when they read tracked vehicles, and this was my reaction, I thought it meant a vehicle that has GPS on it, that is tracked. And therefore, I was not alarmed. I did not know they were talking about tanks. So when I saw that an agency in California is actually got on their list a tracked vehicle, and it had followed the very minimalist lexicol and just said tracked vehicle, I thought, oh, GPS, not a problem. When I learned that a tracked vehicle is a tank, I was shocked that a small town of 10,000 people wants a tracked vehicle. So I'm confident that city council is going to reject that, but of course, who knows? Who knows? And also expand several definitions to better describe terms.